Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. I'm very excited about my guest today. My guest is Dr. Carl Hendrick. He is a professor of learning science at Academica University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam. He's the author of several books, including How Learning Happens with Paul Kirshner. He holds a PhD in education from King's College London and taught English for several years in both the state and independent sectors in the UK. I think you're going to like this one. Carl, it is wonderful to have you as a guest on Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
It's my great honor, Gene. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you are very esteemed in our community of science of learning. Not only what we talked about in your bio, but you have some new projects that you've started recently.
Yeah,
You wanted
so
to-
yeah, so one of the things that happened, I think, post-COVID, and there was some research in the UK to support this, is that teachers are thinking differently now about professional development. In fact, they're thinking differently about the profession as a whole. A lot of teachers, I think, were sat at home during lockdown and seeing their friends and family working 1 or 2 days a week. And then when everyone went back to work, they had to go, well, this is one of the few jobs where I have to do 5 days a week. I can't, work from home. So one of the things that teachers want is more flexible professional development. So the idea we had was, how can we get the science of learning to teachers? How can we get the best evidence on how learning happens in a way that will be less one and done? Let's do an inset CPD session, come and talk, everyone's on a high for a few days, and then it just fades out. How can we kind of build in a consistent thing? So we have this course based on the two books we wrote. I wrote a book called How Learning Happens with Paul Kirshner, and How Teaching Happens then with Paul and Jim Heal. And we just kind of created this online course, and then we have a platform where teachers can take it. They can do retrieval practice, quizzes, sessions to work with in their faculties or departments. And we're just have so many schools have signed up for it now. We're kind of in Australia, we're in the UK, we're in the US. And it's just, my whole thing is, there's stuff that I wish I knew in my first 5 years of teaching that I just never encountered. And I'm just driven by, let me get to that guy, let me get to that teacher in the first 5 years who knew nothing about working memory, nothing about cognitive load theory, nothing about instructional design or curriculum or assessment. What are the tools that would have made my job better? Hopefully would have improved outcomes for students, but also would have meant that I wasn't wasting my time doing things that had no effect. So we created this course, How Teaching Learning Happens, and so check it out. Anyone who's interested, and we're very proud of it. And we hope, again, there seems to be, along with the great work that you're doing, Gene, a kind of a resurgence of evidence in the science of learning. And if we're in any way, in any small way, a part of that, then we're very honored.
Okay, great. And then I saw also that you just started some sort of partnership with Step Lab.
Yeah, we're doing some events with Step Lab. We're working with them on a fairly big event in June in London, and we're doing myself, Peps, Sarah, Cotting Hat, and Josh, and we're going to do a day on the science of learning in the morning, and then kind of instructional coaching in the afternoon. And we may do that also in the US and in Australia. And yeah, Peps is a really good friend of mine for a long time, and we're just kind of thinking about ways, convergences and overlaps. And they have a fantastic platform and a lot of great
Yes.
examples of coaching and great examples of, just classroom practice. So yeah, it's great to work with those guys.
Well, great. That's exciting that some of your work hopefully will make it over here and we'll be able to take advantage of that. I have to tell you, Carl, I've been looking forward to talking to you for quite a while. And one of the things that was exciting to me when I heard you tell a story about when you were in your band and you came to America and you had a manager who kind of let you know you weren't thinking about things properly,
Yeah.
about your music. Can you
Yeah.
tell that story?
Yeah, sure. So we, in another life, I kind of left school I left my home at 18 and moved to the city centre of Dublin where I grew up, started a band, and then after about 5 years, we managed to sign a record deal with Atlantic Records in the US, amazingly. They got a producer, a guy called Michael Beinhorn, who had produced one of my favorite albums, Super Unknown by Soundgarden. And he produced Red Hot Chili Peppers and Ozzy and I think Soul Asylum and, stuff like that. And so I was the singer-songwriter and he started working with us. And he's just a very kind of no-nonsense guy. I remember he told me this story about Chris Cornell from Soundgarden. He said that he had been brought in to work on their album and he got a demo. And in his words, it was literally just like Led Zeppelin riffs for Chris Cornell to kind of scream over. And he kind of said to them, come back to me when you got some songs. And they were, really annoyed and really unhappy. And he said a few months later, he got a cassette and the first demo, the first song was Black Hole Sun. And he went, okay, now we've got, so when I worked with him, he was like, nothing matters. Just sit there, play a guitar and a song and he was introducing me to all this music like that I didn't know of. So Motown stuff. He introduced me to a band called Neu, a German band. He introduced me to a huge range of stuff, but it really gave me a sense of that creativity is really a case of how much, knowledge you have in that domain and to the extent to which you can be really creative and make connections and do something original is really dependent upon your understanding and what you can manipulate and remix and change within that domain. So that was a learning curve. We weren't good enough as a band. We got dropped. And then I moved to London. And then my idea was to be a novelist. So I wanted to be the next Saul Bellow or the next Philip Roth.
Yeah.
And, I wasn't good at that either. So I did a degree in American literature and then I did a postgrad in teaching. And then I thought, okay, I'll just earn money teaching while I'm writing the great next
Yeah.
American novel. And actually, the teaching thing, I just thought, wow, this is great. I'm really enjoying, this is an amazing thing. So, yeah, that started me as a teacher.
So one of the things that really grabbed me as I've heard you tell that story before, and the producer was telling you, there are no new songs, there are no new stories.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you ever read, there's a book by Joseph Campbell called, it's about myths.
Yes.
You know the one I'm talking about, right? Yeah.
I know the one you're talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah, with the hero's journey.
The hero's journey, yeah. So there's really, there's no new stories. There's these templates that we have. And I think the same is true of most domains of knowledge. And most, Dan Willingham has that wonderful phrase, understanding is remembering in disguise. And it's that thing of drawing together strands and things, disparate elements that you can bring into something or forge something new. And yeah, even in like most men in hitting middle age, Gene, we all end up listening to history podcasts, and I'm listening to. I'm just kind of obsessed with different historical periods, and it's just amazing how I don't know who said it. It might have been Twain because he said most great things, but it was history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and you see those cycles play out again and again in history, and I think the same is true certainly of music and art, but also as we'll talk about in teaching. Ideas come around, but actually there's not really any new ones.
And that's why I brought it up. And I don't know about the UK and other places, but the length of the memories in US schools could be 3 to 5 years. If we're lucky, it's 10 to 15 years. And I think about that there are no new songs, no new stories
Right.
when we're working with teachers. These things that we're talking about are not new. I was thumbing through your book, How Learning Happens Today, and noting all the research that you quoted that was between 100 years old.
Right.
And so it's not new, but it needs to be remembered. Otherwise, we seem to be spinning our wheels so
Yeah.
much that teachers think, oh, I need to be creative. Well, I like the way you just talked about being creative. It's knowing I'm going to paraphrase, but knowing the parameters.
Yeah. And also having constraints. One thing we know
Yes.
about creativity is having constraints is actually something that leads to creativity. And I think that's something missing from a lot of young people today is boredom. I started playing music because I was bored. There was nothing to do. It was four channels on TV. There was no internet. We were, we would play football when we were younger, but when we became teenagers, then there was nothing for us to do. So I learned to play guitar and learned to, even, I have this vivid memory of getting an album, a vinyl album. And when you get a new album and you read every cover, every lyric, the side matters, the set list matters, what's the first song on side two, and I think we're just in an age of constant distraction. There's no gaps for you to get bored or to have constraints. Great writing as well is, I'm kind of glad in a way that I wrote stuff before AI because I think that's now a massive, I feel like I've crossed a threshold from people who were able to write stuff before AI and where it's going now. I'm glad that I struggled over a few books and university and essays and stuff where every word was my own and every sentence was crafted and rewritten and redrafted, because I think that that's going to be a lost art, sadly.
It's a major temptation,
Right.
to do it, to take that time, because one of the things I learned is that writing that first draft, that's easy.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now let's do the work and let's take a look at every word now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's a major temptation. One of the things that also noticed in your background, you talked about being in a band, playing football. You coached football as well, right?
Yeah.
Or soccer,
Yeah.
as we call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed is that so many folks who are advocates of explicit instruction have either an athletic background or some sort of performance background,
Absolutely.
and that's kind of their schema for understanding the whole thing. It all kind of makes sense. Have you found that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant point you make, Gene, because it's amazing to me how we accept truths in other fields, but then in education we somehow think that kids, if they discover stuff for themselves, that's the best way of doing it. And yeah, I coached football, at a very low level, a schoolboy level for a public school in the UK, and we had, a professional coach come in who was a professional player, and he was just brilliant at all the things that we advocate, breaking up larger skill groups into their constituent parts, retrieval practice, interleaving, varying the conditions of practice. So it's a little bit different each time. And, he also had, I think everybody who's a sports fan thinks that they're a brilliant coach. They're an armchair coach and they think, they're screaming at the
Yeah.
manager, or why are you doing this? But got a lot of humility. I thought I knew a lot about football. I'm obsessed with it. I watch it, every week. But my word, when I saw him in action, he was, just he could see stuff, and I really learned that wow, this is really a question of knowledge. He just has this incredible schema of a football pitch and scenarios and different things and how to make, there's such a depth of knowledge that he's able to see stuff that I just had no knowledge of. So that was and we also know that in, dieting or exercise, if you want to get in shape, there's going to be a bit of short-term pain, but you know that you're going to get long-term gain. And I think that's something that is, in education, for whatever reason, we've, that's disputed, which is strange.
Well, I know so many people will say, yeah, they believe in explicit instruction. They, but I don't think they emotionally believe it.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, oh tell me the research. Oh, that sounds good. Okay, I could go along with that. We were doing some walkthroughs the other day in a high school with a principal, and we got out of the classroom and we were kind of discussing what we had seen. And in this classroom, the teacher was the show. I mean, the kids, you know, every once in a while she would ask such a very low level question that the kids, it didn't matter whether they answered it or not. And so we got out. The principal was, pretty favorable. You could tell that the teacher had done a lot of prep and, the kids were compliant, at least whether they were engaged, we don't know. But she's fairly okay with the lesson. And we started talking about it. And she kind of looked at me. And then finally I asked her, were you an athlete? You know, and she just beamed. She said, oh yeah. I said, what was your sport? She said, basketball. I said, okay, imagine I'm going to teach you how to do a crossover dribble. Okay. How many times am I going to show you? Maybe twice. And then what's going to happen? Oh, I'm going to practice. Yeah. Well, you know what? It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And you know what? It was like you could just see the light bulbs go off, not because I'm smart, but that's just the way I got it
Right.
as well. I could see that. And then now she had that. She owned it. And she would now be able to generalize when she went into a classroom. Does the teacher allow them to practice? Are they giving any feedback to them? So I just think it's so powerful. I mean, it's just like teaching, right? There has to be some sort of schema that we attach our new knowledge to. And I think it's so powerful. And so, again, I really harp on this because most teachers have some sort of performance in their background.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's one of those things where I think with teaching, the feedback loops are so long that in sport, you have Robin Hogarth's distinction between a wicked environment and a kind environment. So a kind learning environment is a tennis court or, as you said, a basketball court because it's kind because if you make a mistake, you get instant feedback and the loops are really short. Ah, I see what I did. So, you hit a serve. Oh, okay, I haven't got the right angle on that. And chess is the same. You get punished quickly, you see what you did wrong. Teaching, it's what Hogarth calls a wicked learning environment. You mightn't find out that you did something wrong for 6 months or even longer or ever. So you don't get that, initial kind of feedback that, you can actually, as I did for many years, thought I was teaching great lessons. And actually, I look back at them now and I think it's amazing they learned anything. So sport is and performance, as you say, is really, from that point of view, people understand instinctively, okay, this stuff is important, retrieval practice, deliberate practice, purposeful practice, identifying things to focus on. But as we said, direct instruction for whatever reason, as a methodology in the US was, you had follow through in the 60s, you had a very big experiment for 10 years, and then it hasn't been adopted for whatever reason.
Well, we have the wars. We had math wars in the 60s, and then we had the reading wars. And then, now just following folks on social media, now we've got well, are you an explicit direction person or are you a project based? And I think that's the other thing that's so wonderful about being an athlete or a coach. You realize, hey, I'm a project based person. Every Friday night, we're going to go out there, but guess what? Everything we worked on, we broke down and we were working on specific skills. So,
That's
yeah.
That's it. And I think with everybody wants kids to be discovery learners, but we all have different ways of getting there. So we would say, well, if you want to get expert at something, you got to do deliberate practice. You need a lot of upfront instruction, explicit instruction. You need constant checking for understanding. You need constant pointing towards feedback and things you can improve. And then, when you get to that kind of 75% stage, by all means, discover, you've got the knowledge, you've got the routines, then you got to practice it. So as Paul and I said in the book, discovery learning is a bad way to do discovery learning, or independent learning is a bad way to become an independent learner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and just look at your story about being the football coach and having an expert come in. You
Right.
were ready, you were ready for him.
Yeah.
He'd have been a waste of time for you had he showed up, several years earlier because you just weren't ready. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
well, let's back up a little bit. You talked about some things that you guys are working on for professional development, PD over here, CPD over there. And
Right.
so I'm really all about getting this stuff into the classroom, getting the teachers to do it. What do you think the gap is, from even the best PD to getting a teacher to do it, to try something? I'm going to say to try something.
So I think there's kind of three levels to this. The first one is that we have, maybe 70 years of really solid evidence about how learning happens, but in laboratory conditions. So we have a lot of evidence about learning, about memory, about processing, encoding, retrieval. We have a lot of solid evidence on that. We have not much of how to operationalize that in a classroom. So now it's highly unlikely that memory is going to work in a lab one way and then not work in a classroom in a similar way, in the same way that when people discovered the germ theory of disease, it made sense to kind of follow that through to hospitals and with clinical staff. So I think the first thing is that we need a lot better understanding of how, say, for example, retrieval practice. You can say to teachers, here's the principles behind it, here's how it works. But it's amazing to me how those lethal mutations develop. So, retrieval practice, you would think, how can you get that wrong? But we constantly see teachers trying to do it. And, an example I saw recently, a teacher who kids come in, 5 questions. The kids are copying down the questions in the book. So if you didn't know, if you were just standing at the back, it looked like they were answering the questions. But when you look closely, they're just writing down the question. They're just writing the questions, not the answers. So they're doing no thinking. There's no wheels turning. And then they're just waiting, and the teacher's not doing anything. He's kind of stood behind the desk going, okay, everyone seems to be working great. Then he goes, right, here are the answers. Check yourself. And as he's giving the answers, half the kids are just writing the answers underneath the question. And then, and I'm thinking, okay, so this is just, busy work. There's no retrieval going on here. So another common example is teachers who will say, give a class a quiz, spelling test every Monday. Great, you got 6 out of 6, 10 out of 10. And then they never encounter those words again, other than just randomly by chance. So you've learned the word. Now we'll move on. No, there's no kind of re-encountering or how that's structured in. So that research is the first thing. The second thing I think is there isn't a culture in schools of like what you have in other fields and other professions where there's a kind of a professional practice. And instructional coaching is that, I think, because that gives you there's a focus on rehearsal, there's a focus on identifying things to improve upon, very kind of targeted practice. But for the longest time in education, that was just not a part of the adoption of research, thinking about applied research was just not a part of being a teacher. It was kind of, here's your degree. Now you know what to do. You stand in front of kids, how hard can it be? So that's the second thing. And then I think the third thing is that you see with a lot of teachers that with the workload that they have now, and this seems to be a global problem of recruitment and retention. So teachers are just leaving the profession, whereas it used to be the case where, both my uncles were teachers and they had an amazing life as a teacher. They were able to afford a home, a comfortable home in a nice area, a nice life. That's not so true anymore. If you're a young person now in your 20s and you're starting out, that's not really on the table now. So you can't get a mortgage on a teacher's salary. It's the cost of living is such now that you probably need to do something else. So the deal is bad. So even where schools put a lot of time and effort into PD, there's that maybe 20, even 30% churn over of staff. So every year you've got a quarter to third of the staff who didn't have the training from last year. So they don't know what the system is. They don't know, so you have to kind of constantly retrain staff. So there's a kind of systemic problem, but my belief is that there's kind of fundamentals of how learning happens. There's fundamentals of how we attend to, focus on, and process knowledge, and how do we remember stuff? How do we create that change in long-term memory? And really what good teachers do is they internalize that, and when they make decisions, you were talking there about the game. When you play the game on the Friday night, you're making decisions, but hopefully you're making smart ones. I remember talking to, when I was coaching football, there was one of the coaches he was actually a player in the Premier League. He played for Chelsea. And I remember going, gee, who? And he goes, yeah, and I was like, wow. And I was asking him all these stories about, like, tell me about, being a professional. And he said, honestly, the difference when you get to the elite level, most players they're kind of at the same. So all those guys who were the best in their neighborhood, when they get to the pro level, they're much of a muchness. Yes, you have the Messis and the Maradonas who are complete outliers, or the Michael Jordans. They're just one in a million. Most of them are kind of at a similar level. And he said the big difference is the ones who just make better decisions. It comes down to decision making. And those really effective players, they have this mental schema or model of, okay, I'm in this situation. I have five different options. I just instinctively know to choose this one because I have this, developed schema. I think that's what effective teachers do, but they do it based upon knowledge of the limitations of working memory. They know that, okay, if I do this thing now, that's going to overload them. And if I do this thing now, they're going to be really busy, but they're probably not going to learn anything. If I do this thing now, they're going to not like it in the short term, but they're absolutely going to know it in the long term. So I think if you can furnish teachers with that knowledge of how learning happens, of, the basic, what Sweller calls cognitive architecture, you're putting them in a position where they're making decisions in the moment that hopefully is going to lead to better long-term learning outcomes.
Well, my metaphor for the last few months has been your statement about no new songs, no new stories. And again, it gets back to what this premier player said. I might have five options. Well, if you're not a premier player, your options are unlimited. You don't
Yes.
know what to do. And I think that, it gets back to what you're saying
Right.
is this research provides the constraints. It doesn't provide the answers to your problems, but it
Yeah.
gives you some constraints to make better decisions.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Gene. And that's the hard thing because there's a sort of a paradox there where you're kind of saying you're free to make decisions, but here you also have these constraints. And those constraints, in the same way as, I don't know, when Lennon and McCartney, all they had, as Bob Dylan said, three chords and the truth. He actually nicked it from a country singer whose name escapes me. But, when you just have this to work with, you've got to even be more creative. And that's, I think, this is, I think, where we're in a kind of desert of, I mean, maybe I'm just old, Gene, but I don't see any music today that is, I feel like we're in, 50 years on from the 60s that we'll be saying, yeah, though, even when I was a kid, you know, Nirvana, I remember that coming out. I remember and that's certainly no new stories. That's just a rehash of other stuff, but
Yeah.
had this energy. It had, a vitality to it. I don't see much around today that I think is, I just think everything is atomized. Everything's too easy. It's too easy to make music now. It's too easy there's no constraint on it. There's no cost to it. You had to learn the chords. You had to learn the technique. You had to be able to write the songs. You had to be able to, you know, communicate meaning through lyrics in a song. That's why bands were so prized because it was such a rare talent. And now it doesn't cost you anything really to do that now. So you didn't earn it. You didn't have to struggle to get there. So therefore there's no prize on it. And yeah, it's a brilliant point you make. That tension between constraints and freedom is probably where, great practice is.
Maybe when we are hiring teachers who are musicians, we want to ask, were you just a cover band? Because now they could go in and they could imitate. Because I think that's another paradox, when we talk about teachers here in the US, we need to teach them as, we treat them as professionals and we need to, yes, we need to treat them as professionals, but we need to realize that they are on a learning curve and they don't know everything yet. And I can tell you, I don't know how you were as an individual, but for me, if somebody said, "Here's your script, now go teach," I'd have choked on it a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then what I put in my books? Some scripts.
Yeah.
You do this, but that allows you to learn it. That allows you to learn it.
That's the challenge, isn't it, Gene? Because that's one of the things that teachers will just, that and planning their own lessons. And I'm now, Robert Pondiscio, I saw him, he gave a talk at an event I was at, and he was basically making a claim that banging the drum that teachers shouldn't really be planning their own curriculum or planning their own lessons. And yeah, I think for any teacher out there, if you hear that and you go, "Oh, I don't like that," but actually, when you see really brilliantly designed curricula and properly sequenced, and it's an art and it's a very specific skill, and I don't think most teachers have that. But to go back to your analogy of music as well, like I think there's an element to it where you can say, here's a song, here's a standard, do your own improvised version of it, but you've got something to kind of base yourself on. And what we're asking, so if you give teachers, well, today you have 5 lessons. So here comes the sun. Here is Strawberry Fields Forever. Here's, well, I won't make them all Beatles song, but here's Painted Black. Here's, and feel free to go off script, but you want to hit that chorus and you want to, this is the riff, that's what you want to hit. Whereas what we're asking teachers to do is for to go into their classrooms every day and write those songs themselves. And that's an impossibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, my work over the last, couple decades has been helping teachers design lessons design lessons and deliver lessons with tips on both. But now I've realized that, you can have AI write you a lesson. And so now what I want to
Right.
do, and I've been looking for somebody, with the knowledge, of how to use AI. I've sent them PDFs of my book and said, okay, now let's create something and or let teachers know you don't have to create this. Take a look at your AI created lesson, but here's a checklist you need to go through.
Right.
Do they have, are these principles embedded? Where are you going to ask your questions? Where are, what are the questions you're going to ask, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't eliminate it, but it doesn't kill them, because they got to do, all these lessons all the time.
Have you read Daisy Christou wrote a brilliant blog on just this about this idea of human in the loop, where, and I was thinking a good metaphor for this is, you know, like a cleaning solution. If it's 100% alcohol, it's no good because the alcohol evaporates. But if it's 80%, so you have this weird paradox where 80% is more effective than 100%. And so this similar with AI, where 100% AI is really not good. But if you have exactly what you just said, maybe 80%, and then the 20% is what the human does, where they maybe filter it through an algorithm or checklist or, and that's, the phrase is human in the loop. And I think, yeah, that's going to be, you can certainly see an algorithm where you can feed in 100 papers on retrieval and, your book and other books, and then go, okay, make me a sequence of 5 lessons on the causes of World War One. Give me retrieval, interleaving, deliberate practice opportunities, and then you've got the basic, you've got the chords, you've got the melody, you've got the lyrics, speed it up or slow it down if you want to, maybe have a little saxophone solo in there if you want, but, keep you got the basic song there.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see that, Gene, because I think, it's just going to be a question of efficiency and effectiveness. And it's just not I mean, writing curricula and designing instruction is a really, you know, really hard thing to do. And if you can, let's say teaching is curriculum, instruction, and assessment, if you could cut out the admin and the planning and the marking and just say to teachers, okay, the promise we're going to give you is just do what you love doing. Interacting with kids, seeing them learn, helping them along, the socio-emotional aspect of it. We don't want you to waste all your energy marking books that they never even look at anyway, or planning lessons where they don't look at the learning objective that you've carefully crafted, or the long lesson plans that you keep writing, which are, a waste of time. So yeah, I could definitely see us in 5, 10 years time being in a different world.
With respect to writing lessons, one of the things that I found when I started doing this consulting and going to various schools is that teachers are not trained in teacher-directed instruction or explicit instruction. But there's this huge assumption as they can do it. You'll have textbooks that will give them a lesson, and then they'll say, if the students can't do it at this point, teach an explicit lesson as your last resort, and with the assumption that they're going to do it well. And I don't know, I haven't been everywhere, but everywhere that I've worked, there's an assumption I know how to do explicit instruction. I know, I do, we do, you do. And then you know what? It's not done effectively at all. and we can even leave out all the things that you've talked about so far with regards to working memory, cognitive load. I mean, none of that is in there, but there's no place to put it because there's no there there. The lessons are so ineffective. Is that an issue in the UK? Are they taught how to do explicit lessons?
No, and this is, I mean, it's definitely changed in the last 10 years in the UK. There's been a lot more awareness, I think, maybe of the science of learning and phonics and different things, but it's certainly not, it's a universal thing that most teachers are trained at ed departments, universities, and there's a lot of research that shows that cognitive science is really not a feature of education departments. It's taught in many other departments ahead of education, which is a bizarre thing, that you have one department who trains teachers and then another department in the same university studying memory, learning, retrieval, instruction, and they never cross over. There's no, and the guys training the teachers are often, philosophers or, and kind of third-rate philosophers at that, you know, advocating, which, in a lot of cases, just like sociology, and kind of thinly veiled activism. And I think that teachers should have a basics on the functions of the brain, how learning happens, and also just the hard fought victories in instructional design. Certainly for, you mentioned the reading wars. I mean, I think there's a broad consensus now, even from the whole language advocates, that it's not all systematic synthetic phonics, but phonics is a huge part of it. And that wasn't the case for a long time.
Yeah.
So, why has that not been a part of teacher training? And even like, say, take the Dunlosky work on study skills from, 10, 15 years ago, like that rereading and highlighting stuff's not a good way to study. You want to test yourself in the short term. You want those desirable difficulties. It's just not known. It's not known by students. It's not known by teaching staff. And I'm constantly shocked at you just assume people know stuff. And particularly if they're a teacher, if their job is to get kids to remember stuff, and there's no knowledge of memory or how it functions. And it's, again, it's one of those things where we'll be a profession truly when we are thinking about those things at a much deeper level.
You mentioned, I think, continuing on with that thought, you mentioned desirable difficulties. Another thing that we encounter in training people, like say, we're working with a new district right now, and I think the administration, we're starting our training with the administration. But I think, excuse me, very wisely, they invited the teachers union in to hear everything that we're talking about. So after a couple sessions, I talked to the head of the teachers union and I said, what do you think about this? Our training. And he goes, oh man, this is really good stuff. I said, great. What do you think? How's your folks going to like it? How are the teachers going to take it? And he said, the big problem is you're using a lot of terms that they're familiar with, and they will say, we already do that. And when you said desirable difficulties, boy, there's another term that is, we think we know what somebody else is talking about, but no, that there's not desirable difficulties. It's like we're not telling the kids. We're not
Yeah,
doing any teaching.
it's
But
just
it's stuff to,
difficulties, not the desirable bit, but just difficulties.
yeah, it's just difficulties. Well, let me ask you something that is you've kind of been around the world talking to people, and we know that students are the same. But when we take a look at, systems at the classroom level, is the classroom level different? Are there qualitatively different things going on at that level? Because I know that I've talked to people from the UK, man, you have a standardized curriculum. We can't get a district to agree on what
Yeah.
we're going to do. But so at the classroom level, does everything kind of even out?
That's a really great question, Gene. I think that there are cultural, like within a school, there's a culture within a school. That's the first thing you notice. Where if the culture in the school is respectful, is, you don't need to have silent corridors or, scripted lessons and all that stuff. But if there's a general sense of decorum, of, kind of purpose towards learning, you can be pretty much sure that there's learning happening. When you go to a school where you just sense it when you get in the door that it's kind of, yeah, this boat is rocking. It's not steady. Then so there's the cultural things, but I would say that in to your point that we're more similar than different in how we learn. And if that were not true, then we wouldn't be unable to teach a class of 30 kids. If we were so unique and different, which we are, of course, every child is different and unique and special, but there's a convergence, and the vast majority of kids process information, store information, retrieve it, encode it in the same way. Like nutrition, everyone has preferences. Everyone, kids like pizza, some like mushroom, blah, blah, blah. But at a general level, if you eat a lot of sugar, 99% of people there's something's going to happen to you. If you eat a lot of salad, a different thing's going to happen to you on average over a long period of time. Yes, there are people with allergies, and we should meet their needs, and we should, likewise with the curriculum in schools, we should attend to kids with special needs. Absolutely. And by the way, I think we're talking about direct instruction. In my experience, that works even better with kids who have special education needs. The clarity of it, the boundaries, often works. So I think that the conditions of most classrooms are pretty similar other than, behavior. But if a school doesn't have a grip on the culture, the wider culture of learning, then I think for teachers, they're often fighting an uphill battle before they even get in the classroom.
So if you're going to make teachers' lives better, if you are making teachers' lives better, so what would you tell them to stop doing? What would you tell them to start doing that they would be not easy, maybe, but simple?
Number one, you shouldn't be working harder than the kids. So Dylan William, who's really, I think, an authority on everything, but particularly he has an uncanny ability to phrase things in a way that's Dan Willingham is like that too. And he has this wonderful phrase, feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. And I think that'd be the first thing. So if you're going to give any kind of feedback to students, you better be sure that they're acting upon it, that your effort wasn't wasted. And that means actually even building in time for them to do it. So if you mark a set of 30 books and you've written down, please improve this, or please rewrite this paragraph, or please redo this, you want to absolutely make sure that they're going to do it, maybe even in front of you. Okay, here's your books back. You've got 30 minutes to go over the mistakes or rewrite this paragraph or improve it in some way. Whereas what most teachers do is they spend an hour, 2 hours marking books, they give it back to the kids. The kids just glance at the grade and then they move on. And then 2 weeks later, the teacher says to the kid, I just told you that 2 weeks ago. Why didn't you? Well, they didn't look at the feedback or they didn't act upon it. I think number two, I would say you don't need to plan 3 lessons for every lesson like I did when I started out, where I was told that each learner has different learning styles. You should really think about the kind of misconceptions that kids, so if you're teaching a concept, don't just think about getting it right. Think about how kids can get it wrong and have a really, that's a hallmark of really effective teachers. They don't just, as Lee Schulman says, they don't just know the content, they know it in several ways. So they know this scene that they're about to teach. They know about this scene in Macbeth, but they have in their head 5 or 6 misconceptions that a 14-year-old will have. That's something that an actor doesn't have. That's something that an academic doesn't have. That's really a teacher-specific skill. Schulman calls it pedagogical content knowledge. You really understand how kids can get it wrong and have those misconceptions going into your teaching where you can identify them and change them. I would say if there's one lever that you can pull and get good at, and I've been talking a lot about this recently, it's probably checking for understanding. There's one thing you can do in a classroom. You want to get that data often, get it early, consistently throughout a lesson. So let's say you're teaching for an hour. You don't want to find out on 45 minutes that they've completely misunderstood the thing you've been working on for 45 minutes. You want to get snapshots of that as you're going along. And you want to get some, you know, start off the lesson. What did we talk about last lesson? And how does that link to this? What's the concept we want to bring forward into this lesson? Write down three things. Then you want to do some, basic fact checking as you're going along. What did I just say? Explain it to your partner, explain it to yourself, explain it to me. And then leading up to much more richer analytical questions where they're taking the knowledge you've taught them and kind of using and mixing it. But that thing of just constantly getting kids to think about their thinking and think about, okay, do I know this? Do I get this? And if you imagine, one thing I've been thinking about recently, Gene, is this idea of like in sport, like coaches talk about phases. I noticed this a lot. They don't talk about the game as one thing. They talk about there's a certain phase in the game, and it might be an offensive phase, it might be a defensive phase, it might be the phase after the opposition have just scored a goal. And there's a different set of objectives there. But if you think about a 20-minute phase in a lesson, I've been trying to model this for teachers where go, okay, here's what I used to do. Here's the lesson, kids. This is the topic. I'd explain it for 5 minutes. And then I go, right, take out your notebooks. They'd start making notes. Everyone busy, me talking, explaining stuff. Great. 50 minutes into the lesson. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to write this paragraph. So watch the board. You do this first, and then you do this. And, do you know the answer? Then you do this. Everyone okay with that? Yeah, yeah. And then maybe, 40 minutes go, right, now you have to do it yourself. Okay. Do it yourself. I told you what to do. You do it yourself. And then maybe I just at that point, I'm going, okay, everyone happy with that? Everyone okay? Any questions? If you think about that phase of a 20-minute, 30-minute phase in a lesson versus the girl who's doing, or the teacher who's doing maybe 20 snapshots of getting really rich data from the students. What do you know? How do you know it? What do you not know? What are your misconceptions? That teachers, they're able to adapt. They have the agility to go, okay, right, well, it's clear to me that you don't quite get this thing. So we're going to come back to that. I've scanned the room. I've asked you a question. You've shown me on mini whiteboards. You've shown me on finger voting. I'm going to come back to that point because I don't feel that we cover that. So get good at checking for understanding, have an understanding of how the brain learns, make sure the kids are working, that they're thinking hard in your lesson, and get a culture going of we have a go at things. The right answer doesn't matter. Grades don't matter. What matters is effort and genuinely having a go and having the ability to be wrong, the ability to contribute. And again, that's a kind of cultural thing. So I would say those things initially.
That's good advice. That's good advice. And at this point, Carl, I'm going to ask you, do you have a question for me?
Yeah, I do have a question for you, Gene. I was wondering, you were talking there about DI, direct instruction, and this idea of no news stories. What would you say, when you first started teaching, what are the things that you noticed, or what are the things that you notice now that you would say are the big changes? And let me split the question into two parts. So, what are the things that you would say in 2025, these things are better than when I was teaching? And then secondly, which things now would you say are worse?
Not for me personally, but as I see it, as
Right.
I'm working with
As you
schools.
see it, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So what I see that is worse and is that what I mentioned earlier, the idea of what explicit instruction looks like. And I'll give you an example of where that manifests in the United States. Oh, a couple administrations ago, a couple presidential administrations ago, we were working to develop a common set of standards across the country. And they weren't, it wasn't really prescriptive, but just the idea that, you know what, if you graduate from high school in Oklahoma, you learn the same stuff as if you'd have been in California or Florida or wherever. And so, but with that, also with that was some commentary that we want kids to be doing more thinking on more critical thinking. And do you know what the message came out of that is that we're not teaching anymore. We had special ed teachers saying, oh, we've got these new standards. We're not even supposed to teach the kids anymore. So that has, we recovered a little bit from that because they realized, well, you got to teach these kids. But it has gotten worse because of lessons that you can get, AI generated lessons. You can get, you know, we have a multitude of technology platforms that, digital platforms for the teachers to use, that after COVID, many classrooms never went back to teacher directed instruction.
Right.
So much is driven by the digital platforms and the companies that sell them, that say, you know what, if this is going to be effective for you, your third graders have to be on this for 30 minutes a day. you know but not only in English, in math as well. And so, or I think that's, where things have gotten worse, the idea of instruction. In retrospect, it was never really that great. As I said, people said, oh, we're doing explicit instruction. Yeah, you are, but not well. And so I think it's just deteriorated. I know that the licensing programs in the universities are still, they're not training people per se, but they're educating them in the manner in which you said. We learn about the sociology, we learn about second language learners, we learn about all of these things, but we don't learn how to implement programs that will impact those things. So we're fighting that, and we'll see where we're going now. As we're recording this today, we just eliminated our Department of Education, which for us meant so many supplemental funds to those impoverished schools that hired support teachers, support staff to try to mitigate some of the issues, brought on with poverty. So I don't know. I don't know where we're going. But having said that, I think the biggest thing that we can do is that every teacher, as a baseline, is proficient in explicit instruction. Before we, I joke about, I don't know if you're a golfer, but okay, so you'll understand this. So I went into a secondhand sporting goods store, and the sign on the door said, you don't need $1,000 clubs if you have a $200 swing. And that's what I think about. We have kids that aren't doing well. What's the first thing we do? Well, let's assess them for intervention.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, they're not doing well in intervention. Maybe we need a new program for it. So, well, wait a second. Let's take a look at, what we call tier one, just that initial instruction. So I think that's where we've been. That's where we are. And a lot of people have to die before I'm in charge, Carl, but that's what I would want for everybody.
That's a great phrase. You don't need $1,000 club with a $200 swing. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, yeah. That's the title of your next book, Gene.
No, you know what the title of my next book is? N of one. N of one, because I'm going to satisfy me. This is, and I don't know how you are, Carl, but I'm a staff member that if I'm in a PD, when I was on staff, I'd be in the back with my arms folded.
Yeah.
You're not going to teach me anything. So if I can if I can turn me, then I can turn anybody.
I was the same. Yeah, for sure. And not I sat through some truly awful stuff, so sometimes it was warranted, but sometimes not.
Carl, it has been a pleasure. And hang on for 1 second. I'm going to say
Sure.
goodbye. But you know what? I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So thank you very much.
A real joy to talk to you, Gene. A really interesting conversation.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused Adaptable Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles. Talk to you soon.